for
Good
joining
morning.
us. I'm Lauren Peretti, and I am joined this morning by my colleague, Shannon Quinn Sheeran. And Shannon and I are with Housing Innovations, and we are part of the team at Housing Innovations that provides support to the Connecticut Balance of State Continuum of Care. So our session today is about the Permanent Supportive Housing Requirements and Operations Guide. So if you find yourself in the wrong room and you did not mean to be here for that topic, please don't feel bad about stepping off. That is what we're going to be covering today. Before we jump in, just a couple really quick housekeeping things. We love to be able to see you guys. We don't get to see you in person much anymore. So if you can turn your camera on, that would be great. It also is nice for you all to be able to see each other, although we certainly understand if on camera is not in the cards for you this morning. We like these things to be interactive. It's a lot more interesting if Shannon and I aren't the only two people who are speaking. So please don't hesitate to unmute yourselves, to make comments, to ask questions, to make suggestions for different tools or resources you need from our team. You can do that again. You can just unmute and speak. You can raise your hand. You can put things in the chat. Shannon and I will monitor the chat throughout the course of the webinar this morning. Don't wait for us to invite you to ask questions. Just interrupt at any time. We're very informal about the way that we do these things. So we will, I think, be able to get to all of the questions today because we're scheduled for 2 hours to end at noon. We may not need all of that time depending upon how many questions we get. So we'll end early, gift you back some time in your busy day if we can. And if we don't get to all of your questions, feel free at any time to reach out to us. Our team is always available to answer questions. My email and Shannon's email is on the last slide in the deck this morning. So please never hesitate to reach out. Shannon has put into the chat the link to the slides for today, as well as the link to the operations guide that we're going to be talking about today. So we will both try to be mindful that some of you may be very new to the COC. I know we've got some folks who've been around for a long time that we have known for many years, but I also see some new faces. So if we are saying anything, we'll try not to use a lot of acronyms, but if we say anything that is confusing to you, that you don't understand, please stop us, because if it's confusing to you, it's probably also confusing to someone else. And our goal today is to make things clearer for you, not to make things more confusing for you. So, this is our agenda for this morning. We are not going to try to jam in all of the permanent supportive housing requirements into this 2-hour webinar. So rather, what we're going to be doing is talking about the guide and what's in the guide, and then in particular, what's new in the guide for all permanent supportive housing projects, and then the most significant new requirements for permanent supportive housing projects that are not funded through DMHAS. So we've got comprehensive training, compliance training slides up on the webinar. So if you've not been before to one of the more comprehensive compliance trainings that we've done, we invite you to visit the training page on the webinar. We most recently recorded in-depth sessions on participant eligibility documentation, on the housing requirements in the continuum of care projects, on fiscal requirements in the continuum of care projects, and on the CT BOSS grievance process. So please check those out if you weren't able to join us when we did them live. And as always, if you're looking for a particular training and you can't find it on our website, please let us know and we can either help you locate it on our website, or if it's not content that we've already developed, we can put it into our queue to be developed for you guys. So this is our agenda. We're going to do a quick Zoom poll in a moment so that we can get a better sense of who's on the call with us or on the webinar with us this morning. We're going to just do a quick overview of the operations guide, who it's intended for, and what you can find in the guide. And then we're going to focus most of our time together this morning on new requirements in the guide. We'll start with things that are new for everyone or new-ish for everyone, because some of the things that we're going to talk about are new really in the last 12 months, not brand new. And then we will talk about the things that are new only if you are from a permanent supportive housing project that is not funded through DMHAS. So if you are with a DMHAS project and you're already familiar with the guide and the requirements in the guide, we will invite you to hop off if you want once we get to that part, although you're certainly welcome to stay on if the refresher would be helpful for you. We'll wrap up looking at some resources that are available on the website, and then, like I said, want to make sure that we hear all your suggestions and get as many of your questions answered as we can today, and we will do that throughout the course of the webinar, not just at the end. So, all right, I think we are going to start with a quick Zoom poll. So Shannon, can you get that launched?
Mm-hmm.
Great. So we're just asking, what is your current role? This just gives us a sense of who's in the room today. What's your current role and how long you've been involved in COC projects? We'll give you a minute or two to get your responses in. We've got 92 people in the room this morning, so yeah. Quite a crowd.
Yeah. All right, looks like most people have participated. I'm going to go ahead and end and then share the results.
Thanks, Shannon.
Sure.
So it looks like the bulk of our folks, which is as I would expect, are from a case management / supportive services provider. We've got some folks from that are either from one of the DMHAS local mental health authorities, LMHAs, or who are providing housing coordination or rental assistance administration. Housing providers, a couple of our government partners are in the room, some of our coordinated access network are in the room, and then other. So if you put in other and you want to tell us where you're from, feel free to plop that in the chat. So, and then in terms of how long people have been involved in the COC, wow. So almost half of us have been involved for more than 5 years. So this is a seasoned crowd we have here this morning. And then we've got some people who are really pretty new, about 20% less than a year, and then about a quarter of folks 1 to 3 years, and then some folks who've been slightly longer. So, all right, well, that's helpful for us. If you are one of the folks who've been around for 5 years or more, please bear with us. We're going to probably say some things that you guys already know well this morning. So, all right. So our next slide. So these are the links. So throughout the webinar this morning, you'll see text that is green and underscored, and those are live hyperlinks. So when you open the PDF of the slides that Shannon has linked to in the chat, those will take you directly to our website and all of the different documents and tools that we're going to talk about. So the guide that we're talking about this morning, as well as all of the forms that DMHAS requires that their COC rental assistance project use, are on the CT Boss website on the resources page. If you're from a project that is not a DMHAS project, if you're from a DMHAS project, right, you are required to use those forms. If you're from a project that is not a DMHAS PSH project, the operation guide actually has some new requirements that apply to you, and there are some of those forms that you are now going to be required to use, and we'll go through today what those are. But in general, those forms, most of those forms are not going to be required for you, but many of them might be a good resource for you. So if you're from a non-DMHAS project and you haven't checked out that area on the website, you may want to check it out because there are likely things there that are helpful to you, even if they are not required. So Lisa Callahan, is Lisa with us this morning? I don't know if I saw Lisa, but anyway, thank you to Lisa. Lisa has done a great job in compiling a checklist of all of the forms that are required for the DMHAS COC PSH project. She makes updates to that checklist frequently to keep it current. So if you're with a DMHAS project, please be sure that you are using that checklist. It's a really helpful resource to make sure that you are gathering all of the documents that are required in your participant charts. Similarly, if you are from a non-DMHAS project, our team at Housing Innovations keeps this participant chart documentation tool up to date, and that tool will show you not just for PSH, but really for all of the different kinds of COC projects, what documents you're required to keep in your participant chart. So we encourage you to use those tools if you are not already. Whenever we update these checklists or other resources that we have on the website, we always send out an email. So please remember, if you are not already, to register for the CT Boss emails, and you can do that by going to our webpage. There's a place right on the homepage where you can sign up for emails. So the best way to make sure that you're up to date is making sure that you are getting those emails.
All Lisa right. Is here. She just popped in the chat that she's here.
Hey.
So want to say thanks again. Yeah.
Hey, Lisa. We were just singing your praises about the checklist that you've done for the DMHAS project. So, so thanks for that, Lisa.
Thank you. I'm here.
Thanks for joining us. So, all right. So this is just a little bit of background on the PSH requirements and operations guide that we're going to be talking about today. So the guide was originally released in 2019. So it's almost 4 years old now. But you may not be familiar with it if you're not a DMHAS project, because the guide originally, until very recently, only covered the DMHAS PSH projects. In May of this year, the steering committee voted to adopt the guide for all permanent supportive housing funded by the Connecticut Balance of State. And so the guide, the requirements that are in the guide now apply to all our full portfolio of PSH projects, not just to the DMHAS projects. And so the guide now has policies and procedures that govern our entire portfolio of PSH in the Balance of State, as well as all of the DMHAS COC rental assistance projects statewide, so including those that are located in ODFC, the Opening Doors Fairfield County Continuum of Care, are also required to follow the protocols that are outlined in the guide. The guide also covers all PSH regardless of what your funding is in that PSH and what your COC funding is in that PSH. So it covers tenant-based rental assistance projects, sponsor-based, project-based, as well as projects that are using the leasing budget line item and or the operating budget line item. This includes projects that are funded through DOH, the Department of Housing, as well as projects funded through DMHAS, as well as projects that are just directly funded through HUD without passing through either DOH or DMHAS. All right. And so this is the target audience for the guide. So all of the folks who are listed on this slide, if you're not already familiar with the guide, you want to try to get familiar with what's in the guide. So nonprofit agency staff who provide or coordinate services for folks that live in PSH, LMHA or local mental health authority staff, and nonprofit agency staff who administer COC rental assistance and or provide housing coordination services to PSH tenants. And then if your agency has other kinds of programs, right, not PSH programs, so for example, transitional housing programs, we don't have an operating guide for transitional housing in CT BOSS. We have very little transitional housing. So even though the requirements in the guide, many of them are not, some of them don't apply to you, it's probably a helpful resource because there's going to be a lot of things that are really HUD requirements that do apply to you. And there's just a lot of information about best practices, even if they're not requirements. If you are from a rapid rehousing, an agency that also runs rapid rehousing, there's a separate guide on the CT BOSS website for rapid rehousing. So you should use that guide and not the PSH guide. All right. So one of the things that the guide does is it outlines the roles and responsibilities of different partners in our permanent supportive housing projects. So many of our PSH projects involve multiple partner agencies, right? So you might have one agency or DMHAS, the LMHA, right, that's administering rental assistance, another agency that's providing supportive services. Many of you are leasing units from private market landlords, right? And we always say that one of the most important things in any kind of successful partnership is that everyone understands what they are responsible for, right? So there are clearly defined roles and responsibilities, ideally, that are written down. And so the guide defines who is responsible for what in PSH projects. And so we want to go quickly through some of the terminology that's used in the guide to help us understand those responsibilities. So the guide uses these two terms, housing provider and service provider, and assigns responsibility to whomever is in that role in our PSH projects, right? So the housing providers are either the local mental health authorities and or nonprofit agencies. They're administering rental assistance and providing housing coordination. And then when the guide refers to service provider, right, that's the nonprofit agency that's providing case management services to our participants. And then in some cases, we still have, although that number's dwindling because we are trying to fund services through our new project application process every year. We do still have some projects in Boston that don't have a designated service provider. So we've got some rental assistance projects where there is no supportive services budget line item, and there is no agency funded by DMHAS to provide services specifically for that project. So in that case, the guide defines the responsibilities of the LMHA for trying to link people to case management services. So in some cases, your agency may play both of these roles. You may be both the housing provider and the service provider. Ideally, you have two different teams. That's part of our housing first requirements, right? We always say we don't want our social worker and our landlord to be the same person. So ideally, those responsibilities are divided, even if they are both, one agency is responsible for both, they're separate staff who fulfill both of those functions. So, so as I said, the guide really goes in detail into, who's responsible for what across these different roles. Your project may have divided up the responsibilities a little differently than what we wrote about in the guide, and that's okay, right? We don't care if we come out and monitor. We're not going to care who's doing what. If you've got your housing provider doing something that in the guide it says the service provider should do, that's fine, as long as someone's doing it, right? If you are dividing the responsibilities differently than how they are described in the guide, we would encourage you to make sure that that's clear to your partners, and ideally that it's written down. So you may want to go through that section of the guide to make sure that all of the responsibilities are assigned to someone, and to make sure that all of the partners in your particular project are clear about who is responsible for what, and that everyone is on the same page. Sometimes when we come out and monitor, we see a situation where, you know, one entity says, oh, the other entity is responsible for that. And there's like, you know, kind of confusion among among the partners about who's responsible for what. The guide also defines responsibilities for the folks that live in our permanent supportive housing, right? So for our project participants, for the property owners, the landlords from whom you are renting units, the folks that work at the DMHAS Homeless and Housing Services Unit. So that's Lisa and Alice and the folks on their team, as well as the folks at the Department of Housing, so Steve and Lee and Kara and Katie, as well as our partners at the Coordinated Access Networks. They play a super important role and their responsibilities are defined, as well as our responsibilities at the Connecticut Balance of State Continuum Care and the Opening Doors Fairfield County Continuum of Care. So, so now we're gonna get into the meat of the matter here and talk about the requirements that are new or new-ish, and that the guide, we've updated the guide to reflect these changes. So the first thing we want to talk about is that, and I said this already, but it bears repeating, right? The main change that was instituted in the May update to the guide is that the guide now applies to all permanent supportive housing across CT-BOSS, regardless of whether you're a DMHAS project or not. So that is the main change. And then another pretty significant change is that folks probably know that in the last competition cycle, there were actually 2 opportunities from HUD to get funded. One was our regular NOFO, Notice of Funding opportunity that we apply for every year. And then last year, HUD also did this supplemental Notice of Funding opportunity, and CT-BOSS was awarded, yay, funds to serve folks who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness, as well as folks who are living in Litchfield County, which is considered a rural area by HUD. So we did get some permanent supportive housing funded through that SNOFO, and that permanent supportive housing will be using a different definition of disability than the usual DMHAS definition of disability. I see Deanna has her hand up. Hey, Deanna.
Hi, thanks, Lauren. I probably should let you finish. So the broader definition, including physical impairment and brain injury, that will be for all PSH?
Nope, just for the SNOFO PSH.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So good question. So normally, right, if your project is funded through DMHAS, you are required to use DMHAS's definition of disability, which is narrower than the HUD definition of disability. So for most of the DMHAS PSH, and this remains the case, right, you've got to serve only people who have a serious mental illness or a substance use disorder or have a disability that's related to AIDS. Now, in only the SNOFO PSH projects that are funded through DMHAS, those projects are also going to be able to serve people that have a physical disability, a brain injury, or a developmental disability. So basically, the SNOFO DMHAS PSH projects are just going to use the HUD definition of disability without those additional limitations that DMHAS normally puts on eligibility. And so, you know, all of the PSH, because this is a HUD requirement, you still have to use the HUD, the 3 qualifying factors that HUD places. So the disability has to be expected to be of long continuing or indefinite duration. It has to substantially impede someone's ability to live independently, and the condition has to be potentially able to be improved by provision of more suitable housing conditions. Those things still apply. Shannon and I did a very detailed webinar just on eligibility requirements and how to document eligibility. And we went into a lot more detail on this in that webinar. So please check that out on the training page if you haven't already watched it or you weren't with us when we did it live. All right, so this next set of things applies to all of our PSH and is new-ish, right? So things, new policies that the steering committee adopted in the last 12 months that really apply actually not just to all of our PSH, but to all of our projects in CTBOS. And so we have updated the guide to incorporate these new things. So the first one is that we've got new coordinated access network policies. Are not really new. We've got updated, revised coordinated access network policies. Those were adopted by the steering committee in May of this year, so just last month. So if you are still using the old coordinated access network policies, please discard those, go to our website and get the new version. And the major changes there are really the policies were updated to just reflect the reality of the on the ground now, to incorporate the new hubs and some revised 211 protocols. Excuse me, I'm going to sneeze. Oh, not yet. Also updated to clarify the assessment process. So a couple of changes there in the assessment process. The prioritization criteria have been updated to reflect that length of time homeless is the primary factor that we use when considering how to prioritize. And then finally, the last major change is that the policies were updated to reflect the current version of the by name list known as the BNL 2.0. So I think a lot of those changes were already happening in practice on the ground. It was just a matter of updating the policies to reflect the current state of affairs. All right, so this is actually not new. The CTBOS Emergency Transfer Plan that's linked here on this slide is actually not new. It's just provides some important context for the next slide, which is something that is new. So those of you who've been around for a long time know about the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA. It's a federal law that protects survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. And it protects everyone, regardless of gender. So I don't know why they continue to call it the Violence Against Women Act, but they do. But in fact, it doesn't matter what gender you are. The protections are available to all of us. And, we know that DV and homelessness, there's a lot of crossover, right? DV is a common cause of homelessness, and, having a safe home is incredibly important for everyone, including folks that are recovering from some sort of domestic violence situation. And so one of the ways that we can help make sure that people are safe as they move on from homelessness and domestic violence is that we offer the opportunity to move to a different unit if someone is unsafe in the unit where they are currently living because of some sort of domestic violence situation. HUD requires us to offer them and prioritize them to move to a new unit. So people who need an emergency transfer because of some sort of domestic violence situation get first priority for a unit that opens up. They do not have to get into the usual can line. And people qualify for an emergency transfer if they reasonably believe that they are at imminent risk of violence, if they remain in their current unit, and or if they have been the victim of a sexual assault that happened in their unit or on the property where they live within 90 days of the transfer request. So what's new? So none of that is new, right? That's been in place for a long time. What is new is that we have a requirement now that we proactively inform people about this right to an emergency transfer. And so, having a right to something isn't helpful unless I know that I have that right. And so we want to make sure that people know about our emergency transfer policy so that they can use it if they need it. And, We know that intimate partner violence is extremely common, right? Nationally, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men have experienced intimate partner violence. We know that among transgender people, the rate of IPV is even higher. And so we need to tell everyone about their emergency transfer rights, regardless of gender, and regardless of whether or not we know that they are or have in their life experienced domestic violence, because we just don't know. It's very common experience for people, and we don't know what we don't know. So Connecticut Balance, I see your hand. I'm going to finish, and then and then I'll take your question. So Connecticut CT Boss recently, within the last, I think it was in September, the steering committee passed a policy that requires that our CANs, as well as all of our COC and ESG, which is the Emergency Solutions Grant, all projects that are funded by either of those funding sources are required when somebody applies for assistance, so that would be the CAN, right? When they enter your project, and when you recertify them annually, that you inform people about their emergency transfer rights. And so we have a notice. That notice is linked here in both English and Spanish. And you should provide that to everyone at those times. And, there's a lot of information people get at these times, right? They're inundated with forms and information. And so we really ask that you not just hand them the piece of paper and say, here, sign this, but that you actually go through it a little bit to help them understand, to reinforce for them that they have this important right. So someone had their hand up. I don't know if I've answered your question or you still have that question. I'll pause for a minute.
Hi, Lauren, it's Caroline Beltry. Have a quick
Hey,
question
Caroline.
regarding the VAWA.
Yeah.
I see that if someone is experiencing domestic violence and they have to leave their unit, is it the transfer only available for transferring to another unit within the project?
Good question. Excellent question.
Would this person's project-based voucher, can it now be converted to a portable voucher if they wanted to leave? Because the fact is that if they've experienced domestic violence with someone, transferring them to another unit, they're still going to have access to them. So they would probably want to be away from that person, unless that person, was incarcerated and then they feel safe. So what
question.
would it look like?
Yeah, so the right is actually to transfer, if it's safe, right? You might have a scattered site program, right? That is, you've got units all over the city, and it would be safe for that person to transfer to a different scattered site unit still within your project, right? So that's certainly an option for people. But where that's not an option, either because moving within your catchment area anywhere is still not going to be safe for them, or because you're a congregate project, which I think maybe is the circumstance that you're describing, and being in a different unit in the same building is not going to be helpful. In that case, the transfer right is to transfer to any project, right? They can transfer it to any project. And again, regardless of whether they're transferring within a project or to a different project, they have the right to get the first available unit. So they're going to be prioritized over all other applicants. They can actually transfer outside of Connecticut too. So that's a possibility as well. And if you've ever got a case like that, that gets a little bit more complicated. So just feel free to reach out to our team and we can walk you through that as well if that ever happens, that someone needs to really get far away.
I may be reaching out. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, for sure.
Lauren, there's a couple of questions in the chat. If there's no unit available, what's the recommendation for working with these individuals?
So there, the Connecticut has a lot of permanent supportive housing, right? So I think that we should be able, the first thing is that you should work with your CAN, right? And then work outside of your CAN to get the person a unit ASAP. And in most cases, because we've got a big portfolio of units in Connecticut, there's a lot of, regular sort of turnover in those units. We should be able to accommodate that person in a new unit as quickly as possible. And then I think what I would suggest, if you are working with someone in the meantime, right, and they're really in a very critical, dangerous situation, that you consult with our partners at a local DV organization to help that person do some safety planning if you don't have that expertise already on your team. That would be my recommendation, that you really bring in some outside expertise here to help do some safety planning and to help make sure that that person is safe.
And then one more
right.
question was, are there any programs that are excluded from VAWA?
There are no COC programs that are excluded from VAWA. Every single COC program is included in VAWA. So all of the VAWA requirements, not just the emergency transfer plan requirements, are applicable to every single one of our COC projects. Deanna?
Hi, we've had some question around, if the person does not feel safe in their unit, is it the service agency's obligation to hotel them?
I don't think there's any, because the agency, you may not have the money available in your budget to do that. I think that's certainly a great option if you can do that. And, there isn't a unit immediately available. That is potentially a very good safety plan for someone. But there is, you may not have the resources to be able to do that. And so there isn't any requirement that I am aware of, either in certainly in the CT BOSS, we don't have that requirement, nor is it a HUD requirement that you have to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. All right, so I think we're going to do another Zoom poll. So Shannon's going to get that launched for us. All right, so our first question is, which PSH projects are required to follow the operations guide? Second question, what definition of disability applies to PSH projects funded under the SNOFO, or Special Notice of Funding Opportunity? And then third, when are projects required to notify participants of their emergency transfer rights? We'll give you a couple minutes to get these questions answered.
I'm going to give people a few more minutes to participate. I just want to say, which I hope you all know, the point is not a gotcha on these quizzes, right? We're giving you, because there's just a lot of information. It's just repetition, and hopefully repetition will help things be retained in our brains more.
Thanks, Shannon.
All right, looks like, give a few more seconds. Okay, most people have participant. Go ahead and then share results.
All right, so on our first question, which PSH projects are required to follow the guide? So the correct answer is every PSH project in CT BOSS, right? All the projects funded by CT BOSS are required to follow the guide. So it used to be that it only applied to the DMHAS COC rental assistance projects. That changed in May of 2023, and now all projects are required to follow the policies and protocols that are in the guide. Our second question, what disability definition applies to PSH projects funded under the SNOFO? And the correct answer there is the broader HUD definition of disability. So that also is a change. So typically the DMHAS definition applies to the DMHAS projects, but now only for the SNOFO PSH projects, the broader HUD definition applies. And then lastly, when are projects required to notify participants of their emergency transfer rights? And this one was a little bit of a trick question, because it's actually both, right? You're required to do it at project entry as well as at annual recertification. So both of those responses are correct. All right, so.
And
all right,
Lauren, Crane has
yep.
her hand raised.
Hey, Crane.
Hey, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I just wanted to, I think the polls are helpful, kind of keeping us a little, it's just a good refresher, as you said, and keeps us engaged when we can. The comment I wanted to make is to the best of my knowledge, in Greater Hartford, for any VAWA situations we've had in our COC rental assistance, which is a pretty big program, we've been able to transfer people to another grant or help accommodate that move quickly to keep people safe. We don't have funds for hoteling. The other thing is, I don't know of any situation we've had recently in Greater Hartford where we haven't been able to accommodate the change, either within one program or between programs. And then there's times where somebody just like needs to get out of the region. And so we're able to sort of make some arrangement with another CAN, and even if we have to like swap subsidies or something, we've been able to make it happen and do it quickly. Has not been problematic. So I hope that gives us all a little bit of hope in helping people take care of themselves and stay safe. Thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks, Crane. Yeah,
that's
it's an
helpful.
important
Thank-
reminder that it is going to be doable because our portfolio is so big to be able to get people those transfers. So thank you for that important reminder, Crane. All right, so I am going to move quickly through the next set of slides because we're actually running a little bit behind, and I'm going to hold questions until I break. To hand off to Shannon. So, all right. So the next thing we want to talk about is this is another new requirement that, rights don't help people unless they know about them. And so the steering committee recently passed this requirement that projects and CANs are required also to notify people of their rights under our grievance policy, and that you should do that when people apply, at project entry, and at a minimum annually, which I think most projects will do also at recertification. And again, that you also, in addition to just handing people this notice about their rights, and that notice is linked here in both English and Spanish, that you also just have a little conversation with them so that they understand what it is you're handing them. And then, as I said earlier, we did a webinar just on the CT BOSS grievance policy, so check that out if you missed it. Another way in which we make sure people know their rights, we've got this participant bill of rights. It was significantly revised and is now much shorter and simpler. So it is now a one-page document. So if you are using a version of the Bill of Rights that is longer than that, you are not using the current version. So the current version is one page. It's up on the website, linked here in English and Spanish. So please be sure that you are using the current version of the Participant Bill of Rights. And then we've created this tool that you can use to document that you have met these requirements, so that you have provided folks with the Bill of Rights, that you've provided folks with the notice of their rights under the VAWA emergency transfer plan, as well as their notice of their grievance rights. This acknowledgement is also available in English and in Spanish. Feel free to use this format or any other format that you want. So you've got to provide people with these notices. That's not optional. How you document that you've done that is totally up to you. So you can use this format or you can use another format to document. Some agencies have incorporated acknowledgement of receipt of these things into their electronic health record, and that's totally fine. All right. So transfers between PSH projects. So transfers obviously were always allowed between CSH projects. The newest version of the guide just adds some information about the protocol that we use when people are transferring, and transfers between PSH projects can be useful for many different reasons. One of them we just discussed, right? Because someone's unsafe in the unit that they're currently in. People also may want to move because they, want to be closer to their family or to a job or to an educational opportunity. There are cases, unfortunately, sometimes when the relationship between the current provider and the participant has really soured, and that transferring the person to a different project can be helpful in trying to re-engage them effectively in supportive services. And then sometimes we've got people who need more intensive services than what the current project can offer them, and that we could, if we move them to a project that has a better participant to case manager ratio, will be more effective at providing them with the level of services that they need. So, so when you identify someone who needs to be transferred to a different PSH project, and obviously you can only do a transfer of someone who's already in a PSH project, right? So you can't transfer someone to a different project if they're not currently enrolled in a PSH project. The housing coordinator in the project where they currently live should reach out, if it's a DMHAS project, to DMHAS, as well as to the CAN and to the housing coordinator in the project where you want to transfer. And those two housing coordinators will work together along with the CAN to coordinate that transfer. The housing coordinator in the project from which the person is moving should make sure that all of the eligibility documentation, right, so that the disability documentation as well as the homelessness documentation is uploaded to HMIS. And if it is a DMHAS rental assistance project and the area where the person wants to live does not currently have an open certificate or enough wiggle room in budgets to be able to add a certificate, then the tenant can move to that new area, and the rent will continue to be paid by the original grant until a new certificate opens up in the new area where the person is transferring. And once a certificate opens up in the new area, then DMHAS will transfer that cert over to the new area. And then always an important reminder, right? When you are a project that is entering someone, whether it is someone that's brand new to PSH or a transfer PSH tenant, it is always your responsibility to make sure that you have the required eligibility documentation in your client charts, right? If HUD comes and monitors you and you do not have that, those funds are going to be recaptured from your project, not from the project from whom the person transferred and not from the CAN. So you want to make sure as the receiving project that you've done your due diligence and that eligibility documentation is on file. So, all right. So there are circumstances where there are people whose income is too high for them to qualify for a subsidy, right? Because we know that the amount that somebody pays in rent is tied to their income. So there is no income ceiling for PSH participation, right? So somebody could be making $200,000 a year, right? That does not disqualify them from PSH participation. So there may be circumstances in which someone is very disabled, right, and needs case management services in order to be stable in housing, but they've got significant income, right? So that can happen, for example, if somebody has received some kind of a settlement, right? They, receive some kind of insurance settlement or a lawsuit settlement. It can happen if someone has inherited money, has some kind of trust fund or something like that. It can happen if someone wins the lottery, right? So there can be people who have significant income that still need to be in PSH. So before discharging someone from PSH, the requirement is that you assess whether or not they still need case management in order to support their housing stability. And if you think that they do still need the case management and you're a DMHAS project, then you're going to reach out to Lisa or Alice and consult with them before you recertify. And if they agree, then you can recertify them. So they're not going to get a subsidy, but you can still keep them enrolled in the project and you can still provide them with case management. If you're not from a DMHAS project, then you want to consult with a supervisor before you make that determination and recertify them. All right, these next two slides I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. There are circumstances where you can estimate someone's income in a PSH project when you don't have a full month's worth of pay stubs, or when the pay stubs that you have are not reflective of what the anticipated ongoing income is going to be, right? So for example, someone has overtime on the pay stub, but they are not going to be, they had overtime because it was Christmas time and now it's no longer Christmas time. So you can use fewer than 4 weeks in pay stubs to estimate income. This is not new. What's new here is the methodology for doing that. So it used to say in the guide that when you did this math, you could do it based upon 4 weeks in a month. And now the math is a little different, and it needs to be based upon the fact that they are 52 weeks in a year. And this was really just to align our guidance in the guide with the most current HUD guidance. So that's what the next two slides are. And then a little bit on security deposits. So again, this is mostly not new. There's just some details that were added here. So most of this are probably things that you were already doing, certainly if you were a DMHAS project. So when somebody moves out, obviously we know that they are entitled to have their security fund refunded unless they owe back rent or they have done some sort of damage to the unit. And so in order to make sure that the landlord is not improperly deducting from the security refund, we want to do two things, right? We want to document the condition of the unit at move-in. So for example, if there is, a stain on the carpet or a crack in the wall or whatever kind of damage exists in the apartment at the point that someone moves in, you should document that in photos so that when the person moves out, the landlord doesn't say, hey, I'm deducting this amount from the security deposit because the person did that damage. And then again, when the person moves out, if you can, I know this is not always feasible. There are many circumstances in which you just simply can't get access to the unit in order to document this. But when you can, you want to also document the condition of the unit with photos when someone moves out, so that, again, for the same reason, so that the landlord doesn't improperly deduct stuff. And then there's a link here. The Connecticut Judicial Branch has this great guide on all of the many rules around security deposits. So check that out if you are not familiar with it. So, and then the landlord is required to refund the security deposit with interest. If you are a DMHAS project, that refund must be returned to DMHAS, and specifically to whom the refund must be returned is outlined in the operations guide. And you should request that refund in writing at the time that someone moves out of the unit, and provide the landlord again with the information about where they are supposed to send the refund. If you are not a DMHAS project, it is up to you whether or not you want to have that security deposit paid back to you as the agency that issued the security deposit, or you can allow the landlord to return that deposit to the program participant. That can be a nice way if you're able to get a little money in someone's pocket. We know that having some money is crucial to people's housing stability, so especially as they're moving into a new unit. So, all right, one more poll and then I'm going to turn it over to Shannon. Actually though, are there questions before I do the poll on any of the content that I just covered? All right, poll, Shannon.
Okay.
Please.
Oh, here's a question. In case of transfer and there's no opening in another CAN, what's the prioritization for the new client to get a voucher? Is it as soon as there's an opening with a new CAN, or should we leave that with the CAN? What documentation do you recommend?
So when it's an emergency transfer, right, it's that person is top of the line, right? If it's a non-emergency, not a VAWA emergency transfer, right, then you follow the usual CAN protocols that are outlined in the CAN policies and procedures. So what I would recommend is consulting with the policies and procedures. I'm sorry, I don't have those committed to memory, what the prioritization requirements are. So check in that document that we linked to earlier, and the protocols and the processes outlined in that document. Sonia?
Hi, good morning. I had a question in reference to the security deposit return. I think you just said that it was optional if the security deposit goes back to the client or the person. Is that the case? Because I thought the security deposit had to be refunded to the client when they leave.
The security deposit you can, as the program, so DMHAS requires that the security deposit be refunded to them if they paid the security deposit. So you, as a project that is funded directly by HUD, not through DMHAS, can do the same thing. The security deposit can be returned to you. You just want to make sure that you've got that documented in writing through which we'll talk about, Shannon will talk about in a minute, through the HAP agreement, right? Your contract with the landlord should state to where the security deposit needs to be returned. And it's totally fine to make that to be returned to you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Sure.
And there's one more question. Right. When did the no income limit go into effect?
There's never been an income limit in the PSH program. HUD has never had an income limit in PSH.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll.
All right, so these are true and false questions. So the first one, there is an income limit for people entering PSH. The second one, PSH participants reaching a certain income threshold are automatically exited from the program. The last one, housing providers are required to document unit conditions via photos at move in and move out. All of these are true or false, and we'll give you a minute or two to get your answers in.
All right. A few more seconds, but it looks like most people have responded. I'm going to go ahead and end and then share.
All right, so the answer to the first one is false. There is no income limit for people entering PSH. So people are eligible. There's no eligibility requirement that's related to income, whether they're entering PSH or they're already in PSH. They may not get a subsidy if they've got too much income, but if they need the case management in order to stay stably housed, they're disabled, and they need that case management, then they are eligible for PSH regardless of their income. The second one, PSH participants reaching a certain income threshold are automatically exited from the program. I just answered that one as well. That is also false. And then the third one, housing providers are required to document unit conditions via photos at move in and move out. That is true. You should be documenting conditions of the unit at move in and move out so that the landlord does not erroneously make deductions from the security deposits.
So Angie is asking a question. I know you're getting ready to transfer over to me. What if there's no budgeted line item for services? So I guess this is
question,
entry.
Angie.
Yeah,
good question. Right. So if you've got somebody that is in a PSH project and that project has no budgeted line item for services, right? Ideally, there is still a way, because it's PSH, right? So PSH has a service component to it. So there should be some protocol for linking those people to services, even though you've got no services specifically designated for that project. So people could still remain in the projects and be, you could be helping them. It may make more sense in a situation like that, where the only thing the person is really getting from the project is case management, to transfer that person to a different PSH project where they are better equipped to provide for the service needs that the person has. But in most cases, even if the project has no budget line item for services, they should be able to get services, for example, through the local mental health agency. All right, and then I see a question. If the landlord is planning to renovate the unit once the tenant moves, does the landlord should be charging any damages out of the security deposit, knowing he's doing full renovations to the unit? I am not, that's like gets into a nuance of housing law that I don't want to pretend that I know the answer to that. So I'm not going to guess. What I'm going to do is direct you to that link that we had on the slide, to the Connecticut Judicial Branch's guidelines about all of the rules related to security deposits. And if you can't find your answer there, I would say reach out to one of our legal services partners in Connecticut that's more familiar with Connecticut housing law than I am, and they should be able to answer that question for you. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Shannon.
All right. Next slide, right? Okay, so this next set of requirements were best practice recommendations for everyone and are now required for non-DMHAS PSH. They have been required for DMHAS projects for some time. And I think you'll probably find that most, if not all of you, are already doing these things. But I want to invite you to say, if you're a DMHAS project and you've been around for a while, you may want to hop off now because this is going to be some repetition. If you, however, feel like a refresher will be helpful, you're more than welcome to stay on. If you do decide to hop off, there's a whole bunch of resources linked to the end of this presentation, and they start on slide 43, so you may want to check them out. Next slide. Okay, the rental assistance certificate. This applies to rental assistance projects only, so it doesn't apply to leasing projects. There's a DMHAS certificate linked here, which you can use as a template. It has to be modified. There's lots of DMHAS language in it, so it has to be modified for a non-DMHAS program, but you're welcome to use that as a template. So this is what we give people to notify them that they're accepted into a program, and it really gives a person the information they need to start searching for a unit. So it gives the number of bedrooms and FMR, fair market rent, so people will know the rent at which they need to, the price point at which they need to look for a unit that's allowable for them. And it also establishes an expiration date. The participant has 60 days, hopefully with assistance, to locate a unit. And that we all know that the housing market is very tight now. If that doesn't happen within 60 days, the housing provider may issue an extension for up to 60 additional days. If you're a DMHAS provider, you have to get permission from the Office of Housing and Homeless Services unit. And for other types of PSH projects, just a supervisor may approve the extension of that rental certificate. Next slide. Income determination and rent calculation. I think probably most of you have been using this rent calculation tool, but now it's required to use it. And it's really the best way to know that we are giving people all the allowances that they are eligible for, and to know that we're calculating the rent appropriately. So we just covered some of this in the housing requirements webinar. It's the participant's responsibility to notify the provider of any income changes of $40 or more if that income change is expected to be ongoing. And it's our responsibility as providers, if there's a decrease in rent, to recalculate within 5 days of the report, a decrease in income, to recalculate rent within 5 days of the report, and then apply the rent reduction immediately. If there's an increase in income, the rent recalculation is required within 10 business days. And it's our responsibility to notify the participant 30 days in advance of rent increase and apply the increase on the first day of the month following the 30-day notice. So we give an example here. We received notice that the person's income has increased. We sent a notice on May 15th. So 30 days from that would be approximately June 15th, and then the rent will increase on July 1st. Next slide. Income documentation and recertification. So there's lots of things that are optional for participants of PSH projects, but providing income documentation is not one of those things. It is a condition of participation, and it's the only way we can determine what the participants' portion of rent will be. This was also just covered in the housing requirements webinar. So providers can and should offer to give assistance in gathering documentation as warranted and appropriate for project participants, including reasonable accommodations. We can act as a liaison between the Social Security Office, Department of Social Services, or any other entity that provides income and help to gather those documents, but it is not negotiable that they participants have to provide that income documentation. Also, documents must, what the income documentation shows us is the person's income, is the amount, the dollar figure that should be used in the rent calculation. Next slide.
You've got a question from Deanna.
Deanna.
Hi, Shannon, thanks. Quick question on the notice of participants portion. I know understand if income changes during the lease and we change it in the 30-day notice and all that. But sometimes on move-in, it's been a challenge, to provide that 30-day notice because we really can't complete the calculation sheet without knowing where someone's going. And as you know, in this market, sometimes we find a landlord and they want them to move in ASAP and it could only be 2 weeks. So we've run into an issue with that in respect to being able to give the 30-day notice. And, how do we go about doing that?
I think, Lauren will correct me if I'm wrong, the 30-day notice is not for move-in when you're initially entering a project. It's if there's an adjustment in the income and the already established rent is going to be changed and the tenant's portion is going to increase. Lauren, you're going to say something.
That's correct, but I'm not sure, Deanna, if you're asking about somebody that was already enrolled in the project and then moved to a different unit. But regardless, what I would say is that 30-day requirement is a local requirement, not a HUD requirement, right? So by all means, don't let it be a barrier for getting someone housed as quickly as possible, right? Do the best you can to get the person notice about what the rent is going to be as quickly as you can, but don't delay a move-in because you can't meet the 30-day requirement.
Okay, so I apologize, just to follow up. So say someone, whether they're first entering or they're moving to a new unit for whatever the reason may be, eviction or whatever, who would be responsible? So on the first, so say they find something and they need to move out in 2 weeks and they move and we can't give the 30-day notice, who pays the difference in that rent? Am I making sense?
So I think the rent is what the rent is, regardless of whether or not you've done the 30-day notice. And if this is a DMHAS project, no, you were from Chrysalis. Now I'm remembering you guys are not a DMHAS project. So I think
we have both actually.
Okay, you have both. So if I'm saying anything that's wrong from the folks at DMHAS, please correct me. But I think if the person, the person can be responsible for their portion of the rent, right? Regardless of whether or not in circumstances where the circumstances of the case are such that it was not possible to provide that 30-day notice, the tenant can still be responsible for their portion of the rent per the calculation.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
And Lisa will jump in if I'm wrong about that from the DMHAS for DMHAS project.
Yeah, yeah, no, and I think that's accurate. I think what we try to avoid is we can't pay two landlords for the same month.
All right. Next slide. Wait, is there another question? Crane says we typically cover the amount and then make up the difference by a change order if the landlord is owed funds. All right, thank you, Crane. Next slide. Notification of rent obligation. This is a document that's given anytime the rent is calculated. So at project start, annual recertification, or any other time the rent is recalculated. And what it does is provides in writing to the participant. This is the full monthly rent, and it starts on the date. We give the date that it starts. It includes the tenant portion of the rent, so our participants know what's expected of them, and requests that the participant report, reminds them if there's any income change or family composition change, that it's their responsibility to tell us within 10 days. We send a copy to the participant, a copy to the case manager if that's a separate entity, and a copy to the landlord. Next slide. Zoom poll. New for non-DMHAS. Lauren, are you going to? Yeah. So the rental assistance participant, which are true, is issued at annual recertification, notifies participants that they are approved for rental assistance, establishes the amount the tenant pays for rent, establishes the number of bedrooms in FMR, and establishes an expiration date or the number of days to locate a unit. That's question 1. And which statements are true in the following? All PSH projects must use DMHAS rent calculation tool. Participants must report income change of more than $10, and projects must notify participants 30 days in advance of rent increases. Give people a few seconds to answer which ones are true. Obviously, you can choose multiple. Howard always says we need the Jeopardy music while this is happening.
Do,
Right?
do, 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 do.
Yeah.
All right, a couple more seconds, and then I'm gonna end the poll and share the results.
Yeah, thanks, Crane.
All right.
We'll address that in the responses. Okay, so you're sharing the results, which are
Yep.
true in item 1, that the rental assistance certificate notifies that people are approved for rental assistance, establishes the number of bedrooms and FMR, fair market rent, and establishes an expiration date for the rental certificate. For the second question, it's true that all PSH use the DMHAS rent calculation tool. That's a requirement now. The income change item is not true. The limit is $40. It's not 10 and it's not 100 either. So sorry for the discrepancy on the slides and the poll, but it wasn't true either way. It's $40 for the participant to notify us that if that's expected to be ongoing, they need to tell us about that change. And projects must notify tenants 30 days before rent increases. That's a yes. Next slide. All right. Housing assistance payment or HAP contract. This is also, this is for all tenant-based rental assistance projects. And it's provided annually along with the lease. There's a sample document here. Again, it's one that should be customized for non-DMHAS project. And what this is a contract between the landlord and the housing provider. It includes the contract rent, the total rent for the property, the subsidy amount, the amount that the housing provider is going to pay, and then the tenant portion. And we're going to talk on the next slide more about what's included. Okay, so what the contract says is that the subsidy or tenant portions may change, but the landlord, all parties involved will receive written notice if there is a change. It says the landlord agrees to meet landlord obligations, and some examples of those are decent, safe, sanitary housing, to provide utilities as is specified by the lease, and it also states that side deals are prohibited. And it also says that the housing provider may withhold the subsidy if the landlord doesn't meet those obligations. Is there a question? Is this applicable to DOH AIDS funded PSH or just COC PSH through DOH?
So I don't know the rules for the DOH AIDS funded PSH. Amanda, I would ask DOH that question. I will say generally it's a good idea for you to have, as the housing provider, a contract with the landlords that, you know, puts in writing all of the things that Shannon just went through. So even if it's not required, if you are leasing scattered site units and the lease is between the tenant and the landlord, it's a really good idea to have a contract that is between you as the provider of the rental assistance and the landlord.
All right, next slide. So the next few slides are on supportive service requirements. Again, this is not a in-depth training on case management or supportive services, but the guide does outline that these are responsibilities of PSH programs, and we wanted to walk through some of the highlights for you all. DMHAS and various DMHAS partner agencies offer regular trainings on a range of topics that are covered in these next slides. DMHAS strongly encourages housing and service providers to participate regularly in these trainings, and those are recorded and posted on the CT Bus website. There's a link in an upcoming slide where all of those trainings are. And there are also trainings on our trainings page on the case management section, and even some of the, as I was looking through some of these criteria, some of the outreach case management topics that are listed in the outreach trainings on our page are relevant and can be helpful in permanent supportive housing as well. So I'm going to talk about goals a little bit. A lot of times people in PSH programs have a hard time coming up with goals. They're not feeling so hopeful at this point in their lives. So they either say they don't have any goals, or what they say is something that they think we want to hear, right? They say, I'm going to pay my rent in time, or I'm going to attend all my regularly scheduled appointments, things like that. But those aren't really goals that help someone necessarily improve their quality of life, or that they can really feel where their life is improving. So we want to make goals customized, personalized, individualized, and really person-centered for each one of our clients, because we know each person has their own individual hopes and dreams. We know they each have their own history and strengths that they come from, and we want to incorporate them all into a plan moving forward where they can feel an improvement in their quality of life. I've recently had the opportunity to do some trainings with Andrea White, a licensed clinical social worker on our team. And she does great there. And some of her trainings are the DMHAS trainings and the outreach trainings that are posted on the website. She talks about when you're setting goals to really help a person come up with a goal that they can feel, because when you can feel it, it gives you a sense of what you're moving towards, and it might give somebody more motivation to move towards that goal if it's something they can really see as an improvement in their life. I had the opportunity years ago to work with a young man who he was unstably housed, and one of his goals was seeing his children more, right? So when he wasn't stably housed, he had a hard time having regular meetings with them, because he would meet at a park, right? Set up an appointment, and they would meet at a park and had supervised visits there. But it was weather dependent. He had to get transportation. There's a lot of things that went into coordinating that. Whereas if he had stable housing, it would be a regular place where he could have regularly scheduled time with his kids, right? He also, the reunification with his kids was an opportunity to talk about perhaps reducing his substance use, right? Because that could lead to an improved relationship with his kids. And that was really motivating and meaningful for him. So services should be designed for sure to help stabilize people in housing, but also to help kindle or rekindle their hopes about what they want out of their lives, maybe to what their expectations or hopes were before they experienced homelessness. We want to help people develop supportive relationships so that perhaps we are no longer their emergency contact, help make meaningful connections in their own community, maybe their church. People who've experienced homelessness have also often experienced trauma. So one of the most important things we can do to ensure their services are trauma informed is always treat them with respect and always help people, if and when possible, regain more control and agency in their own lives. So take their cues about what's important to them, and we may have to draw that out of them, but really make the things personalized that we're moving forward on. Next slide. So I already said a lot of these topics in what I said in the last slide, but always make sure what we're doing with are flexible and intensive as necessary, but they really are able to adjust to the needs of the client. For projects, and there are many people in our projects who might say they're not interested in case management. So what we want to say to that is services are voluntary for the tenants, but they're not voluntary for the staff. Even when someone tells us to go away, we keep checking in, we call, we text, we even go out if we think there's a concern or we haven't seen a person in a while. And another way to engage is maybe to provide something that they want or need. So maybe we show up with a set of new sheets or new towels once a year if that's something we have access to. Maybe around the holiday time, we bring them a turkey or another bag of groceries. So things like that that can help us engage and help people know, hey, we're still around. We're a resource if and when you need us. So they're familiar with us. If a crisis should arise, they know who to turn to, and they trust us enough to engage with us. For projects with a designated service provider, charts should document in general. Engagement attempts happen at least twice a month. Again, a frequency that makes sense for the participant needs. Attempts that are less frequent should be supported by an assessment that is approved by supervisor and indicates that there is a lower level of service need. Always document all the attempts we're making. When people decline services, we are consistent and use many different methods to try to reach them. Phone, text, email. We go in person. We invite people to local recreational opportunities, program opportunities, and again, attempt to provide any of those concrete resources, toiletries that we have on hand that we might think would be helpful. And lastly, we're always looking for more ways for our participants to provide meaningful opportunities to give input and involvement. So we just sent out an email earlier this week with consumer survey links. That's always an opportunity to get people's input. We can provide focus groups. I've read in some project applications that some of you are coming up with consumer advisory boards for your programs and your agencies, which is an excellent opportunity for people to give input, suggestion boxes, anything else that you can come up with for people to give input into the services that they're receiving. Next slide. So, most projects have one or more agencies that are specifically contracted to provide services to participants. In some, it's the same as the housing provider. These requirements apply when there is a designated service provider. It's a requirement that a needs assessment and a service plan are done at least every 6 months. The service plan is required to be completed within 60 days of project entry, and then update that every 6 months. But it covers what I said in the last couple of slides, specific measurable goals. So if a person's goal is to get a job, break that down into smaller chunks, talk about who's going to do what by when. So an example of what might happen if someone's going to get a job is they're going to choose, or you're going to choose together, 3 jobs to apply for by July 1st. I heard of a participant whose goal it was to be a nurse, right? So some of these goals might be lofty and we think maybe unattainable, or it might take some years to attain it, but you can always break it down into smaller steps and always start where the person is to help them to make progress. So become a nurse, this person, okay, we were looking at her and said, okay, what's your status right now? You need to get a GED. So break it down into small chunks. Where can you get a GED? Find that out. Who's responsible for doing that by when? Sign up for a GED class. Help that person with childcare during the GED class, and then line up transportation. So those types of the things are what we're looking for in the goal statements. And again, it might involve digging deeper to find out what really matters to the person, to help them find a goal that they can feel, to help them find a goal that helps them improve their quality of life. So for instance, I want to use substances less so that I can spend more time with my kids, something like that. Next slide. Housing stabilization services. Owners, landlords, property management companies, they are involved. They are the people responsible for lease enforcement. Service providers, housing providers, case managers, we're responsible for helping participants understand and comply with the lease. So in most cases, home visits should be made more frequently in order to help sustain that stable housing. And the frequency should be responsive, as I said previously, to the participant needs. Home visits, again, that happen less frequently, less than semi-annually, must be supported by an assessment that indicates the person has a lower level of service need. Again, please take advantage of the case management resources that cover motivational interviewing, structuring home visits, mental health, substance use, the goal setting and motivation building. They're all on the trainings page and they're linked here as well. The health and safety checklist, so that's another requirement I just wanted to highlight. So we like to stagger that so that it's 6 months after when somebody enters a project. The HQS, Housing Quality Standards, is another checklist we go through to make sure the unit is habitable and up to standards. Then we like to stagger this, the health and safety checklist comes 6 months after. So every 6 months we're showing, we're seeing the person in their unit to know that it's safe and habitable. Are there questions in the chat, or you handled them, Lauren?
I handled them.
Okay, thank you. Next slide. Moving on, there's again a whole webinar on moving on, but basically programs are required to assess participants who we deem are stable in housing for their interest in moving on. It's not a requirement that people must move on, but in general, it's a good idea. A lot of times people in permanent supportive housing projects feel like they might be sentenced to a lifetime of case management, right? So somebody else is always in your business, and if they've really outgrown the supports needed, if they've really become stabilized, then it might be a good idea, and it might be an opportunity for them to, again, have more agency in their own lives to move on. So when they are interested, what we do is help them know the resources available for affordable housing options, help them to apply if that's something that they need help with and find another unit. We can help people, and hopefully this is something we've already done, connect to alternative service providers, mental health, physical health, behavioral health, connect with their communities, connect with church organizations so that they have supports in place when they do need some assistance after they've moved on. And it's also a possibility for us in our programs to provide temporary support during the transition, even after they've exited the actual unit that has been subsidized by us. They can still continue to receive case management for a limited number of months after they've exited the unit. Next slide. Warning letter. This is something that is sent prior to commencing any termination due to lease and or program violation. And what it does is gives people a notice of what their specific infraction was, the reason they're receiving the warning notice, and that informs people to contact the housing provider as soon as possible to find out what steps and what the time frame is involved to remedy whatever situation that caused the warning to come up. We send this by regular mail. We send a copy to the case manager if that's different from the housing provider, and we keep a copy of that letter in the client chart. Next slide. Okay, we're coming to the end here. Enter something into the chat new that you have learned today. We'll give people a few minutes to put things in the chat. If anyone has questions, you can also ask them now. There'll be time for questions at the end, but if you had a question about what I just covered, you can ask it. Not seeing anything in the chat. That our webinar is to follow up with moving on, and another webinar that you wanted to check out. Great, great. 5-day and 10-day requirements for income changes. Thanks, Crane. Need for services trumps income, right? Correct, in terms of eligibility. We're supposed to take photos that will move in and move out. Yeah, that was new information. $40 income change, right? No income limits. So that was a new thing for many people. So I learned security deposits can be returned to the providers or the project, right? If an individual makes too much money, they can continue to receive case management, but not the subsidy portion, right? That's an important distinction, Lynette, thanks. Current grant can pay when someone transfers, right? Until the new one starts, if that's the only option, yeah. Great, so happy y'all have learned some new things.
So I just want to say some of why this is new to you is because a lot of the things that you just mentioned are actually new requirements for PSH that's not a DMHAS PSH, right? So it's not just that it's new to you, it's a new requirement for all of our DMHAS, non-DMHAS PSH. So that's a big part of why we're doing the webinar today.
Thank you all. Thanks for putting your input into the chat. Next slide. Additional resources. So Lauren mentioned this earlier, to keep current on all information, all new tools, new webinars, new requirements, funding opportunities, sign up for the CT Boss emails. go to the homepage on the CT Boss website, which is linked here, and then you'll be prompted to check the list that applies to you for anything that you, for the emails that you want to get, because sometimes our distribution lists are more targeted. So be sure to have new staff register for that as well. Next slide. These are many of the webinars we referred to earlier in our presentation that we conducted for the most part this spring. So Intro to CT Boss, eligibility documentation, two housing requirement sessions and 2 fiscal requirement sessions, policy and administrative requirements, and then the whole DMHAS training catalog is linked here as well. Next slide.
So I just wanted to say quickly on this. So these are really meant to be an onboarding resource. So the idea here is that over time, we're building out a series of webinars that you can have every time a new staff person comes on, because we know that you all are struggling with a lot of staff turnover, so that you can, everything that you need to orient people to the COC's requirements is recorded in a webinar, and you can use this series as you onboard new people coming onto your team.
Federal requirements. There are lots of federal requirements. They're extensive. They include the COC program interim rule. The entire program changed significantly with the HARF Act and release of the interim rule in 2012. So that is linked here. There's a document, a resource that has much to do with fiscal requirements, administrative requirements, cost principles audits. That's linked here as well. And then COC program notices from HUD. That link is here for you all as well. So layered on top of the federal requirements are local requirements. There are a lot of rules that are spread across many different documents, and those are on our policies page. The COC monitoring guide is linked here, and the monitoring guide is intended to pull the most important requirements together in one place to make it easier, to make it more transparent for people to understand what the rules are and how to follow the rules. That's linked here.
So then I just wanted to also say here, so the operations guide also does the same thing. So the monitoring guide is a little bit more in depth. So the operations guide is probably the place to start if you've not already read the operations guide. And then the monitoring guide goes into even another kind of level of further detail on some topics, particularly fiscal stuff, than the operating guide does.
Case management supportive services resources are posted to this page. So the trainings page that I've mentioned and Lauren's mentioned a few times, the DMHAS catalog page is linked here. CCH website has many resources and webinars posted. Corporation for Supportive Housing website has case management supportive services resources, and so does the NAEH, National Alliance to End Homelessness website. There's a comment. I found the new Bill of Rights on the website, but there's no signature line. Is there supposed to be a signature line? I can check that out for you.
So there's not supposed to be a signature line. So let me go back to the slide. So back here. Here we go. So this document, acknowledgement of receipt, so this is where people sign off that they've received it. So if you don't already have another way that your agency uses to get people to acknowledge that they've received all of these notices, you can use this resource that's linked on this slide.
Thanks, Lauren.
Sure. Is that where we were?
51, I think the next one, yeah. Other resources, so available on the resources webpage, eligibility tools. We talked about all the eligibility documents that we covered in the eligibility webinar. Participant chart monitoring prep guidance is a great resource. CT bus monitoring links to helpful resources. And then on the trainings webpage, deep dives once again into a plethora of topics, including grievance policy, equity, inclusion, much, much more. All right. Any final questions, ideas, suggestions?
I was hoping you could repeat how long has the zero income limit been in effect? I'm sorry, I had background noise when you answered.
So there has never been a HUD requirement on, when you say zero income, you mean
No limit on income.
Yeah. So HUD has never had a income eligibility requirement. So there's never been a cap on income. Now DMHAS may have at some point for your projects had some sort of cap. I don't know the timeline for that.
Okay.
But HUD has never had a cap on income.
Got it. Thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, no,
Sure.
I think we were following old Section 8 rules about income in the past, so we would be a little bit more flexible. But for the legacy shelter plus care with no services attached, there were times when somebody's income would go up, but they would always have such a variable income because of their disabling condition that we could keep them in even if they, for a little while, if they were paying all the rent. We kind of support them financially for a minute with the availability of the subsidy if their income went down. And then if they stabilized, they kind of graduated and were self-sufficient, but oftentimes in those situations, that variability continued. So the support was helpful.
Yeah. And I think, when it comes to employment income, right, if someone's stable enough that they've got a great job and they're making enough money that they can afford rent on their own, in most cases, it's not going to make sense, as you're pointing out, to continue them in case management, right? They're not going to need that level of support. In most cases, it's going to make sense to, transition the person out of the project to help them to move on and to link them up to whatever they need through mainstream resources in the community. But there are times when someone, may have a lot of income, but is very unstable despite that income, and then it makes sense to keep them in.
Yeah, we've seen that with folks with severe mental illness. They, they were in a projects-based unit, and I think they inherited like an ongoing monthly income that would normally, just like put them over income, but it's not like a lump sum, which is an asset. That's very different from ongoing monthly income. Thanks so much. I really appreciate your help. It's been great today. I think Amanda has a question too.
Hi, Lauren. I just had a comment too that might help with Amanda. I had this happen with someone who got a job over income, was paying the entire rent. We decided to hang on to them for at least that 90 days to make sure that they stayed stable in the job. And in fact, they lost the income and ended up not leaving the program. So I would say at least like that 90 days.
Yeah, thanks, Deanna. That's helpful. And Amanda, there is no defined length of time that we say, oh, you can only keep them for 90 days or 180 days. It really is dependent upon the assessment that you do, right? And I think when as Deanna's pointing out, right, like when the job or whatever the income is a new thing, right, you might want to err on the side of keeping them enrolled for a little longer to make sure that it sticks. But remember that like PSH really is intended for people, not just as a rent subsidy, right, but for people who need that case management support. So this shouldn't be our affordable housing solution, although I know sometimes it is because there is no other affordable housing available. But the goal should be, if all the person really needs is the subsidy, to get them on a list for some other kind of supported, subsidized housing, Section 8, public housing, whatever resources exist in your community, so that we can preserve the scarce PSH resources for the people that are significantly disabled and really need the case management supports.
Then Amanda asks if the services are funded by a different funding stream, but doesn't have a separate HMIS enrollment, how do we make that work?
And if services are funded by a different funding stream, I think probably, Amanda, it would be good for us to talk through the particulars of the case, maybe one-on-one. So if you have got a particular situation that you're trying to navigate, call someone on our team. And when it's an HMIS related question, we're probably going to want to loop in someone from Nutmeg as well to make sure we're giving you the right information.
But I think that's going to be very program specific, and regardless, it probably has to be decided on a case by case basis. Yeah, but we're happy to talk through the options with you. Any other questions, ideas, suggestions?
I have a question.
Go ahead, Florian.
Hi, just talking about the client, the income might go over. I have one client where that was almost the case this year, but if her income went beyond where the subsidy would mean she was paying more for us than for the rent, how would that translate into doing the program with the rent calculation and so forth? Because she's not going to be paying us anymore,
Yeah.
right? She'd be paying the landlord directly.
Is that how your program works? Does the participant pay the landlord directly, their portion?
No, we are leasing. So we pay 100% of the rent directly to the landlord. That's the whole premise. So how would this work if the client still needed the services, but the income is too high? We're no longer paying the rent to the landlord.
I think
I'm not
possibly in
sure.
order to stick with your program model where you pay the rent to the landlord, which is unique, which is not common among CT BOSS PSH projects, but I think you probably would have her pay the full amount of the rent to you all, and then you cut the check to the landlord.
Oh, okay.
Correct.
All right. And then there was one other area on the, I think it's the housing quality.
Housing
Assessment.
quality standards, HQS?
Yes, that was on the monitoring. I believe that was not required of leasing projects. Is that changed?
No, HQS is required for if you've got a leasing budget line item or a rental assistance budget line item. HQS is required. It is not required if you've got only an operating budget line item.
No, it's just that our program is leasing. We're not rental assistance.
Right. So if you've got a leasing budget line item, you should be doing HQS, I think. Let me just look that up really quickly to make sure I'm not saying the right thing, but I think it's also required in leasing. Bear with me one second, move on to the next question.
Does anyone else have other questions while we're looking up the item for Florian?
Could probably just do some fill-in space here, Shannon. That particularly with the income processes, when someone makes so much income that they're paying the full amount of their rent and there's no rental assistance, usually there's going to be a time where the tenant is tired of all of the forms and the required document protocol, and they will request to be released from the program. So it tends to be a process of client choice. And that's a great process and a great situation to be in.
Yeah, that's a good reminder, Rob. We just take that opportunity whenever somebody's paying the full amount of their rent to bring up all the strengths and progress that they've made, right? And yeah, you don't have to be sentenced to a lifetime of case management and following our rules and filling out our forms. That's a great point. Thanks.
I did just confirm that, Florian. So HQS is required by HUD for both leasing and rental assistance projects.
Okay,
If you've got a leasing budget line item. If all you have is an operating budget line item, then it is not required.
okay, thank you.
All right. Any other questions? I think I might stop the recording, but any other questions before we end the session?